A Reveal investigation has uncovered an unprecedented number of people who died inside Georgia prisons last year.
Even after the officer found Bobby not breathing, he's seen walking to get help.
I have never seen the prison so chaotic, so violent, and so out of control.
By one count, 44 states don't have air conditioning in all their prisons. 10 of those states are in the South, where the heat wave has been unrelenting. Temperatures as high as 145
is inhumane.
Tense moments in a Minnesota prison today when about 100 inmates refused to return to their cells.
𝗪𝗧𝗡𝗧 says the men were protesting their movement being restricted, limiting their access to clean drinking water in the hot prison.
The Supermax is life after death. It adds punishment to the crime, in my opinion, far much worse than death.
The United States represents 5% of the world's population, and yet it's home to nearly 25% of the world's prison population. The only country with more people in prison on Earth is China. China is home to 1.4 billion people. By comparison, the United States has a population of only 330 million people, and yet the United States has only around 25,000 fewer prisoners than China. And now, a former US president may be joining the ranks of the incarcerated. As a 77-year-old white alleged billionaire, Trump is not representative of the average prison population. So in honor of our former commander-in-chief potentially serving some serious jail time, I wanted to present him with a little handy primer, a guide to the US prison industrial complex, one which he helped further privatize during his tenure as president, one where 42% of the prison population is made up of black men, despite the fact that black men only make up 6.5% of the whole US population. In a country where spending on prisons sits at around $87 billion per year, where spending on prisons and jails has increased at triple the rate of spending on public education over the last 30 years. And yet, despite this public spending, it's also a country where the prison population is subject to forced labor, non-existent healthcare, squalor-like cell conditions, poor hygiene and nutrition, and extensive use of corporal and other inhumane punishments. Lord knows that if Trump were to be sentenced to any actual jail time, he'd get some sort of Pablo Escobar-style rich person prison, because prison is really meant to punish the poorest among us. And it was designed as a place to control the vast populations of people of color who could no longer be legally controlled via enslavement. This is why so many people are in prison in the US. Roll the intro. My perfect angel daughter Moira and I would like to thank my partner on today's video, Sundays. Most healthy dog foods are frankly an expensive frozen mess. And I don't know if you've ever met a bulldog before, but being goopy is not something that they need help with. So adding goopy foods to the mix is really not it. Sundays is dog food that works with your life. No defrosting, no prep, no cleanup, just healthy and easy. Sundays is 100% human grade and uses only real food ingredients that you can recognize, pronounce, and probably eat yourself. It's not kibble, pre-cooked, or frozen. It's gently air-dried to preserve nutrition and flavor. It was founded by veterinarian Dr. 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏 because she couldn't find a dog food that was as nutritious as home-cooked meals or as convenient as dry food. So over 3 years and over 17 formulations, she made it herself. We love that. And Moira loves Sundays, don't you? You love it? I get that starting your pup on a new food is a big deal, which is why Sundays offers samples. This gives your pup a chance to try Sundays and fall in love. You just pay shipping and handling. And when you're ready, check out the link in my description and use this code to get 35% off your first order. Thanks, Sundays. Can you say thank you, Sundays? What are you looking at? Is it a ghost? Prison hasn't always been the preferred method of punishment for those convicted of crimes. It only goes back a couple hundred years to the French and American Revolutions. Before that, capital punishment was the preferred form of punishment. Executions were often public and brutal. If execution wasn't ordered, the convicted were usually doled out some form of corporal punishment or public shaming. A public whipping, getting stuck in the pillory, cutting off an ear or a hand, or branding the face or the hands. Punishment was physically painful and turned into a spectacle as a form of deterrence for future criminals. Jails were simply a means of holding on to people that the law wanted to keep track of. This was usually vagrants, debtors, the accused awaiting trial, the damned awaiting punishment, and even those acting as witnesses that the courts wanted to keep an eye on. Jails were often cold, disease and rat-infested basements, and the right to a speedy trial was yet to be enshrined in the Constitution, so the accused could end up spending months or even years in holding, eventually succumbing to the rough conditions before ever getting their day in court. But eventually, public sensibilities changed, thanks to religious awakenings and advancement in medical knowledge, combined with the fact that public punishment didn't really seem to do much to deter crime, so criminal punishment became less of a spectacle, and some academics came together to dream up the idea of prisons and long-term captivity as more humane than public corporal punishment. Plus, at this time in the early 1800s, criminality was beginning to be thought of as a product of a person's environment, as opposed to a racial predisposition, though that's a theory that never really died. So the idea was that creating a controlled environment in the form of a prison where a person was isolated from friends and family and even other prisoners would fix their environmental problems and be a better solution. And despite the fact that the earliest prisons proved that extended periods of solitary time led prisoners to suffer full mental breaks and often led to their muscles fully atrophying from lack of use, the prison became solidified as the primary means of dealing with convicted criminals. All that was needed was just a few tweaks, okay? But eventually they'd figure out a way that was successful. We haven't reached that point, but we have reached a point where we literally can't fathom a different way to manage people who commit crimes, despite the fact that the current system is not working no matter how you look at it. But more on that later. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, marking a pivotal shift in race relations and, it would turn out, criminality in this country. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery once and for all in this country, but not exactly. There's some really important, often overlooked language in the 13th Amendment that creates a glaring loophole that's been exploited since its ratification. The 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. No slavery, except as punishment for a crime. Under our laws, slavery is constitutional if it's used as punishment for a crime." With the passage of the 13th Amendment, 4 million people who carried much of the economy, especially of the South, on their backs were freed from their enslavement. And lawmakers in the South took no time to quickly take advantage of the loophole made clearly available in the 13th Amendment. They began passing laws that criminalized trivial behavior most often engaged in by Black and poor people, turning traditional misdemeanors into felonies. Being unable to provide documentation on demand, selling cotton after dark, petty theft, interracial relationships, vagrancy, and loitering were all criminalized, giving law enforcement the right to round up mostly Black people, convict them, and place them in prisons where, under the 13th Amendment, their labor could continue to be exploited. These prisoners were then leased to companies, such as coal mines and railroads, and forced to work long hours with no pay, doing back-breaking work. They would suffer beatings if they didn't perform. They were given poor nutrition and insufficient clothing and lodging. They would be shot if they tried to escape. In Tennessee, up to 10% of the prison population would die every year because of the inhumane conditions that mimic slavery to a T, but were given the constitutional stamp of approval by the 13th Amendment. Very quickly, that badge of slavery transitioned to being fully equated to the badge of being convicted of a crime. Both groups were dehumanized to the point that society generally accepted that these people were deserving of the treatment they received. And frankly, that dehumanization has continued to the present day. Crime rates rose in the 1960s due to the counterculture movement, a growth in poverty and inequality after the economic boom of the 50s, increase in organized crime, and racial bias in law enforcement practices. And politicians used this rise in crime as an excuse to demonize the civil rights and counterculture movements and lean even more heavily into enforcement of law and order. And Black leaders of the civil rights movement became easy targets. As Van Jones has said, "You can tell the story of white leadership in America and never mention the FBI. You can't tell the story of Black leadership in America without having to deal with the full weight of the criminal justice system weaponized against Black dissent." Martin Luther King Jr. was considered one of the most dangerous men in America. J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panthers the greatest threat to America. Fred Hampton, chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers, was shot in his bed by police. Activist and scholar Angela Davis was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, dismissed, as was Black Liberation Army leader Assata Shakur for arguably false charges, and the list goes on and on. By the 1970s, people were fed up with the growing crime rates. There was a continued focus by the government and the media, especially on the criminality of Black people. Using dog whistles and outright racism, these outlets portrayed Black people as having a predilection for crime, in the same way that formerly enslaved people were treated in the 1860s and the same way enslaved people were treated before emancipation. The idea of Blacks as others, as degenerate half-humans in need of civilizing, this continued in the rhetoric in Washington and the media and had dire consequences for communities of color. These consequences came in the form of prison sentences that disproportionately targeted people of color. And nothing had quite the ring to it like the war on drugs, thanks to Richard Nixon. According to the Law and Order president, public enemy number one is drug abuse. And he leaned heavily on the anti-activist sentiment that had been growing through the unrest of the 1960s, in which Black activists had been painted as the main instigators of crime and disruption. So that by the time the 70s rolled around, the general public was primed to believe that the main source of danger and unrest in the country was the undesirable elements of the Black population, especially those who were impoverished and those who pushed against the status quo in a way that made white America fearful. Fear of slave revolts transitioned nicely to fear of violent Black activist uprisings. And thanks to the Southern strategy implemented by Nixon and his cronies as a means to persuade poor Southern whites to vote Republican by using thinly veiled rhetoric against civil rights activists, Nixon took the White House and saw it as a mandate to implement his war on drugs. But of course, this war was not on all drugs and not on all people. It was the 70s after all. White folks were participating in all sorts of drugs at the time, from weed to cocaine to powerful hallucinogens. And while that was criminalized, it wasn't the main focus for the Law and Order president. The true war was against Black folks and leftist activists who were actively protesting the Vietnam War as Nixon ascended to the White House. And this was an explicit policy. John Ehrlichman, assistant to President Nixon for domestic affairs, is quoted as saying, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." By the time good old Ronnie Reagan came to power in the 1980s, the anti-drug sentiment was firmly established in the American psyche, especially in the South, where Reagan was able to win back Jimmy Carter's Southern voters through a combination of strong allegiance to the religious right and a reliance on dog whistles that spoke strongly to the racist white base that had been primed a decade earlier by Nixon's anti-civil rights rhetoric. As Reagan's campaign strategist Lee Atwater described it, you start out in 1954 saying the N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of it is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. They knew this. By 1982, Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs. Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign focused on prevention, while Reagan's administration waged a frontal assault on all the institutions put in place to help people, including education, welfare, jobs, and healthcare. He projected that this would save the government $1.2 billion, all while poverty and homelessness levels increased precipitously because of these cuts. And studies have shown that poverty is a risk factor for opioid overdoses, unemployment is a risk factor for heroin overdoses, and low education is a risk factor for overdose mortality. Homelessness has also been associated with drug overdoses. The period just after release from incarceration shows a sky-high level of risk for overdose death, and systematic racism contributes to all of these issues. So in increasing the instances of poverty and homelessness, especially among the Black population, Reagan was signing the death certificates for hundreds of thousands of drug users. But he wasn't done. By the mid-80s, Senate committee hearings were conducted to evaluate the risks of crack cocaine, a brand new street drug where powder cocaine was laced with ammonia and sodium bicarbonate, making it cheaper and easier to obtain for low-income Black folks in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. And this was great for cocaine producers in Central America who were able to create and import massive amounts of cocaine into the United States thanks to a little help from their friends, the CIA, who were supporting the Contras in Nicaragua because they were fighting the socialist Nicaraguan government, and the US hates socialism, as we've already established in past videos. Contras. As part of their support of the Contras in Nicaragua and to help them continue to make money to support their fight against the government, the CIA aided the infiltration of large amounts of cocaine into the United States. The amount of CIA involvement is up for debate, but the involvement was real. And when the total cocaine supply outstripped the demand for the expensive powder version, dealers were able to cut it with other chemicals, creating a much cheaper and equally addicting crack cocaine marketed specifically to the impoverished inner-city black people, a population that the Reagan administration had worked so hard to grow through negative economic policies. And in these congressional hearings, instead of treating crack cocaine addiction as a deadly addiction epidemic, they treated it as a criminal problem that had to be dealt with through law, order, and punishment. With the passage of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, Congress made a comprehensive revision of the U.S. Criminal Code for the first time since the early 1900s. This, combined with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, included the creation of mandatory minimum sentencing, especially for drug-related crimes. Generally, full discretion is given to judges to dole out sentences based on the unique circumstances of each case. They are given guidelines and general sentencing suggestions, but judges ultimately get the final discretion. Mandatory minimums, however, remove that discretion from judges and write into law that anyone convicted of certain crimes, such as possession or distribution of certain drugs, have to serve a minimum amount of time for that crime. The judge is legally precluded from giving the person a lower sentence, even if circumstances may warrant it. And crack cocaine, despite being chemically nearly identical to powder cocaine, was criminalized at a much higher rate. The law mandated a minimum sentence of 5 years without parole for possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine. It mandated that same sentence, 5 years without parole, for possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, a 100-to-1 disparity in punishment between crack and powder cocaine. Remember those laws after the Civil War that overly penalized behavior associated with black people? Yeah, this was that, but 120 years later. And while it is true that crack is slightly more concentrated than cocaine, depending on the method of ingestion, the disparity is not 100-to-1. Thanks to laws like mandatory minimums, the United States prison population ballooned, filled to the brim with non-violent drug offenders. In 1972, the prison population was around 300,000. By 1990, it was 1.1 million. Today, it's around 2 million. And this demonization of drugs and criminality among the black population in the US was pushed further along thanks to the media, who loved Reagan, their actor-president who loved public-facing speeches and posing for the cameras. As I've said in past videos, Reagan played the media like a damn fiddle, and the war on drugs was no exception. The Vietnam War in the early 70s was the first war that was televised live. News anchor Walter Cronkite was called the most trusted man in America. By the 1980s, pressure to create captivating news stories was only mounting, as competition from news and other sources competed for US attention. Black men and black people were and are depicted on the news and in the media as criminals, far more than is statistically accurate, even in a country where an outsized portion of the black population are convicted criminals. The media coined the term super predator in the 1980s to describe a generation of black inner-city kids growing up fatherless, godless, and jobless. Hand-wringing about an epidemic of crack babies infiltrating US cities was endlessly covered in newspapers and on the nightly news. Fear of crime and criminals was sensationalized to a point that Americans assumed crime was running rampant everywhere. This graph from the Brennan Center for Justice shows the actual homicide rate compared to headlines mentioning homicide in the same period. The engorged prison population and heightened fear of super predators around every block was the backdrop to the 1988 presidential election between Dukakis and Bush. Dukakis, the Democrat, had a double-digit lead over Bush. That was until an ad was released, telling the story of Willie Horton.
Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man, and repeatedly his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
You see, Dukakis was not only ardently against the death penalty, he also championed prison rehabilitation, including a program that provided weekend passes from prison to some inmates, including convicted murderers. One of those inmates to receive a weekend pass was Willie Horton, a black man who used the weekend pass to escape and subsequently kidnap and a couple. Bush capitalized on this, releasing ads and harping on Dukakis' record on crime. Despite Dukakis' early double-digit lead, Bush leaned on the Willie Horton story as the focal point of his campaign, eventually winning the presidency. After multiple Republican presidents, the Democrats were searching for a win in 1992. So they turned to Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton as a new kind of Democrat, a centrist who supported the death penalty and was tough on crime. During the Clinton administration, a new federal crime bill was passed in 1994, heavily relying on law enforcement and incarceration to deal with the U.S. crime problem. These included more mandatory minimums, 60 new federal capital offenses, building more prisons, and allowing 14-year-olds to be tried as adults. And the country's prison population continued to balloon. But then something interesting happened in the 1990s. For the first time in decades, crime began to plummet. The homicide rate plunged 42%, and violent crime decreased by a third. And this happened everywhere throughout the country. Now, by virtually any metric, we are in one of the least violent times in the history of this country, despite what true crime fanatics, the nightly news, or the bloated prison system might indicate. Correlation and causation are two different things, though, and the reasoning for this precipitous decline in crime in the United States in the 90s is still a mystery among scholars. An obvious answer that many like to point to is that as our prison population has grown, our crime rates have dropped. But this too is likely a case of correlation but not necessarily causation. A landmark 2012 study by the National Academy of Sciences looked at the American prison system and concluded that, on balance, the higher incarceration rates had at most a modest effect on the decline in crime in the 1990s. The panel also found little indication of a deterrent effect, finding that age tends to be a greater indicator of criminality. Most offenders reach a point when they age out of criminal behavior. The panel concluded that lengthy prison sentences are ineffective as a crime control measure in virtually all circumstances, and some research suggests that harsh prison conditions could make inmates more likely to reoffend. Not to mention the fact that while crime has dropped nationwide, the increased imprisonment of people of color has led to devastating consequences for communities of color. There's also the interesting theory that with the removal of lead from gasoline in the Clean Air Act of 1970, there was less neurotoxic effects of lead, which includes stunted intellectual growth and behavioral problems in children. So by the 1990s, when those children were in their 20s, a time with the highest proclivity for criminal activity, they were less affected by lead's toxicity and therefore less likely to commit crimes. One study attributed a 56% drop in violent crime in the 90s to the removal of lead from gasoline. This trend can be seen in other countries as well, though some academics contest these findings. There's also the explanation that increased gun control in the 90s led to the drop in crime. The drop ended in 2000, around the time that gun control measures were reversed by the Bush administration. But you'd think with that reversal, the crime rate would go back up to pre-1990 levels, and it hasn't. There truly is no clear-cut answer or one single thing that can explain the decrease in crime in the US in the 1990s, especially given that in countries where there is a smaller prison population and less police presence, they have lower rates of homicide and other violent crimes than in the US today. So those who point to police and prisons as the answer aren't backed up by the data. Many point to gun ownership as the single determining factor, and it's a pretty convincing argument, but the reality of it is that the data is just not conclusive to determine what is actually contributing to the US being the least dangerous it has ever been. What we do know is that despite violent crime being the lowest it's ever been, and despite a ballooning prison population that assumes criminals are getting locked up at a higher rate in the US than anywhere else, the US homicide rate is 10.5 per 100,000 people, as compared to Europe's less than 2 people per 100,000. The US rate for is 7 times higher than in Europe, and robbery rates are about 4 times higher in the US than in Europe. US teens have higher rates of illicit drug use than Europeans, and the US rate of death from drug overdose disorders is the highest in the world, at 18.75 deaths per 100,000. The world average is 2 deaths per 100,000. So despite the fact that 1 in 5 people in prison today are non-violent drug offenders, accounting for 350,000 people supposedly off the streets and no longer dealing, we still far outpace the entire globe in overdoses and drug usage. So while the causes for the drop in crime in the US are varied and unclear, the solution clearly does not appear to be putting everyone in prison, a practice that has no clear ties to lowering crime, but very real ties to outsized criminalization of Black people and communities. Black people are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white people. If Black people and Hispanic people were incarcerated at the same rates as white people, prison and jail populations would decline by nearly 40%. And I already know in this comment section there's going to be people who say, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, or insinuate that Black people are simply more prone to committing crime than white people, which first of all reeks of eugenics and we don't do that anymore, but also when you put more police officers in a community, they're going to naturally catch more crimes. For example, a study of California law enforcement officers found found that Black Californians were more than twice as likely to be searched during a traffic stop as white Californians. However, searches of Black Californians were statistically somewhat less likely to yield contraband and evidence than searches of white people. So Black people were being searched more, but in those searches it was actually slightly more likely that cops would find something on the white people they searched. Despite this, Black people were almost twice as likely to be booked into jail as white people. Nationwide, white people and Black people use and sell drugs at similar rates. Yet Black people are 2.5 times more likely to get arrested for drug crimes. Because when your neighborhood is over-policed, when you're more likely to get pulled over, when you're poor and you conduct drug use and sales outside as opposed to inside, yeah, you're gonna get arrested more. This has nothing to do with any race's proclivity towards lawlessness. It just means that fewer white people are being caught because they aren't being surveilled as much and they have more generational wealth, aka houses, where they can do their coke and sell their coke in peace. And that leads us to where we are now, a nation that houses and pays for 25% of the world's prison population. And this mass incarceration has led to what many call the prison industrial complex, referring to the massive industries that have sprouted up to serve and profit from the incarceration of humans. And while private prisons are demonized and a huge glaring example of abuses that can run rampant in prisons, with reports finding that private prisons consistently fail to measure up to federal standards in preventing dangerous conditions, intercepting contraband, and ensuring internal accountability for staff misconduct, those facilities, run entirely by private companies, only account for about 7% of all incarcerated people. And while some inmates are employed in prison by private for-profit companies, that only accounts for less than 1% of the prison population. The private companies actually benefiting from the prison industrial complex are those that provide services to prisons, like food services, commissary goods, telecommunication services, healthcare services, if you could call them that, and bail bondsmen. These services make up a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the costs are either shouldered by inmates, who have to pay inflated prices for commissary and phone calls, or taxpayers. Aramark, the food company that supplies food to prisons, and I think also colleges, I'm pretty sure I ate Aramark food in college. They've been accused of having maggots in their food, and they made over $400 million in gross profit for the quarter ending this June, a 14% increase from last year. Not only are inmates overcharged for the things they can buy in prison, they're also underpaid for the labor they perform while they're there. 80% of prison labor is in maintaining the functioning of the prison, so janitorial, maintenance, and food service. They earn on average from 13 to 52 cents per hour. They have to work or they face punishment. They have no right to choose what type of work they do, and U.S. law explicitly excludes incarcerated workers from most workplace protections, like minimum wage, overtime protection. They have no right to unionize, and they're denied workplace safety guarantees. Nationally, incarcerated workers produce over $2 billion per year in goods and over $9 billion per year in services for the maintenance of the prisons. Which is wild. It's almost like an entire industry that requires the continuation of forced, unpaid labor in order to exist. Sounds familiar? And life isn't just rough for the hundreds of thousands of people currently in jail or prison. A conviction also affects people for the rest of their lives, as well as their families and communities. The consequences of mass incarceration are staggering. Nationally, over 800,000 people are on parole, and 2.9 million people are on probation. Millions and millions more have completed their sentences, but are still living with criminal records. This can create extreme barriers to employment, barring certain professions for life, to finding housing, as background checks are common as part of rental agreements. Loan applications and life insurance applications are routinely rejected for those with criminal histories, as well as the social stigma that can increase a person's likelihood of experiencing poverty, homelessness, and drug addiction. Almost a fifth of all people currently in jail are there for a violation of probation or parole. A fifth. And while probation and parole are seen as alternatives to prison confinement, the long terms of this supervision and the numerous and burdensome requirements, including constant surveillance via electronic monitoring, means not only do people not have any expectation of privacy while on probation or parole, this also sets the bar so high that people frequently violate the rules of their parole, often for minor infractions like breaking curfew or failing to pay astronomical supervision fees, leading to more jail time and further tarnishment of their record and the stigma that comes along with all of that. On a larger scale, mass incarceration, wherein Black people and poor people are extremely overrepresented in the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated population, means more control and subjugation of the entire group. Nearly 30% of the Black male population in Alabama today has lost the right to vote as the result of a criminal conviction. For Black men, the likelihood of imprisonment at some point during their lives is 33%. Every Black boy has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison at some point in his life. That affects how people live, how they raise their children, how they experience their daily lives, how they act in public and in private. Mass incarceration invades every aspect of life for those who live in its shadow. And that's entirely the point. Because, as we've already learned, when slavery was outlawed, that little loophole in the 13th Amendment was immediately exploited to maintain the status quo. As Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, has put it, many aspects of the old Jim Crow are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. So it seems that, in America, we haven't ended racial caste, but simply redesigned it. Decades of research has shown that prison is the least effective place to rehabilitate offenders. There are people doing amazing work in the area of prison reform, and it's an uphill battle. The Equal Justice Initiative does work in numerous areas of prison reform, including the death penalty, children in adult prison, wrongful convictions, and excessive punishment, and prison conditions. The ACLU also works to improve prison conditions, push for reduction in incarceration, especially for nonviolent offenders, and promote rehabilitation and treatment programs for those in prison. The alternatives to long-term prison sentences are many. During the COVID pandemic, many states implemented early release for older incarcerated people, especially with health disorders, because research shows that those people are far less likely to commit crimes after release. The Brookings Institute promotes community justice centers, sites that act as a supportive place for people who may be in personal crisis due to mental health conditions, substance use, or family trauma. Using social services to intervene in these situations can lead to better outcomes for individuals and communities than involving the criminal justice system. There's so much more work being done and so much you can do to help, from donating your money to donating your time to volunteering for community-based criminal justice reform efforts. So I encourage you to seek out organizations in your area doing this important work. If you liked this video, you might also like my video about why Americans are so obsessed with guns. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, Anthony Giles and Brett Piontek. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and show notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!